Hello, I'm Steve Bond. I'm a 29-year veteran of the United States Army. I'm here today at the Brevard Veterans Memorial Center to talk about an operation that occurred back in 1989. It was called Operation Just Cause. It was where the U.S. forces overthrew the corrupt Panamanian government in Panama. So join me inside and we'll talk about Just Cause. Before we get started, just a little about me. I served in the Army from the late 1970s to 2004 at every rank from second lieutenant to colonel, and then again as a senior government civilian transition team director in Iraq in 2008-2009. Serving in the Army in the 1970s, I experienced what the military was going through as it came out of the Vietnam War. The draft was ended and we had an all-new volunteer army called VOLAR. In the late 70s and into the 80s, we lived in the shadow of the Vietnam War. Morale was rock bottom as a result of the military widely being viewed as a scapegoat for a failed government policy and lack of strategy for the conflict. There were drug and discipline problems. In 1980, problems with our military capabilities were exposed with the failed attempt to rescue our embassy hostages from Iran. A few years later, Operation Urgent Fury on the small Caribbean island of Grenada showed how a lack of training, funding, old equipment, and the inability for the services to work together needed a major overhaul. During the 1980s, the military began rethinking warfighting. Tough training environments were created at places like the National Training Center for the Army and the Red Flag, Blue Flag exercises for the Air Force. Congress helped with all this by increasing spending for the military and passing legislation to force cooperation among the services with the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. Then came Operation Just Cause. At the time, Just Cause was the largest military operation conducted by the U.S. since the Vietnam War and remains the largest airborne operation conducted since Operation Market Garden in World War II. Just Cause was meticulously planned, rehearsed, and executed to take down Manuel Noriega and the Panamanian Defense Forces, or PDF, in Panama. The lessons from earlier military operations were incorporated into the planning and execution. Just Cause accomplished all the objectives set out by our national leaders and restored confidence in the military. However, Just Cause was largely overshadowed by the much larger Desert Shield and Desert Storm just a few short months later, and in my opinion, became somewhat forgotten. Fate, it seems, sometimes just puts you at a certain place at a certain time. And no, I didn't parachute into Panama, lead troops in combat, or fire a shot in anger. I was a staff officer, the intelligence operations chief for the Joint Task Force designated to conduct the operation. That position, however, allowed me to be involved in the planning, coordinate pieces to support the operation, watch the operation unfold, and observe the senior commanders in action. Back then, I was a newly promoted major, just minted as a military intelligence officer, and freshly out of the Army's Command and General Staff College. I was assigned to the G2, or intelligence staff, of the 18th Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Not long after I arrived, 18th Airborne Corps became the nucleus for planning and the headquarters for all the forces responsible for conducting operations to take down the Noriega regime in Panama. Today, I'll cover what happened, some of my recollections, and the results and impact of Just Cause that still exists today. So, what happened? To set the stage for Just Cause, we need to go back to the early 1900s, when the United States built the Panama Canal and obtained a 99-year lease to operate it. The canal zone was a strategic choke point connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a boon to the U.S. and Panamanian economies, and was also a U.S. territory. By the late 1980s, the Cold War with the Soviet Union was winding down. Central America, meanwhile, had become a hotbed for communist expansion. Drugs and weapons were the coin of the realm. In Panama, Manuel Noriega, a former Panamanian National Guard colonel and U.S. intelligence informant, emerged as the country's authoritarian leader. Noriega used this position to sell information to the U.S., tip off the Colombian drug cartels to U.S. activities, all while brutally squelching political opponents and turning Panama into a transit point for cocaine and weapons. In 1988, he was indicted here in Florida for drug smuggling, racketeering, and money laundering by 2 federal grand juries. This provoked demands for him to step down. In response, Noriega stoked anti-U.S. nationalism. He sought aid from the Cubans and the Soviet Union. In May of 1989, Panama elected a new president, and 70% of the Panamanian voters voted against Noriega. Noriega nullified the election and anointed himself maximum leader, deferentially known as El Jefe, and things turned from bad to worse in Panama. Noriega unleashed the Panamanian Defense Forces, the military, police, and paramilitary thugs to terrorize the opposition leaders, keep the Panamanians in check, and to harass U.S. citizens and our military in Panama. This caused a series of contingency plans to be developed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1989 ultimately named Lieutenant General Carl Steiner, the 3-star commander of 18th Airborne Corps, as the overall commander for the operation. Then, in October of 1989, General Maxwell Thurman became the 4-star commander of Southern Commander Southcom. He was legendary. He had an eye for details, had an incredible work ethic for himself and for those that worked for him. To prepare for eventualities, 18th Airborne Corps deployed additional military police, combat forces, and equipment like Sheridan light tanks and Apache helicopters into Panama. A non-combatant evacuation order, or NEO, was conducted to remove U.S. family members. A series of exercises called sand fleas were conducted to desensitize the PDF to U.S. activities. Noriega had a vice-like grip on Panama through the PDF. They were his strongest supporters, and Noriega's patronage ensured the loyalty of the senior commanders. Graft and corruption ran rampant throughout Panama, with the PDF commanders as the ringleaders. The PDF was primarily a ground force and prided themselves on being jungle fighters. Overall, there were 23,500 military and police, including 9,000 of Noriega henchmen organized into 18 groups of thugs, the so-called Dignity Battalions, or Digbats. Some of the most modern units, such as Battalion 2000, had V-300 armored cars. You can see the organizations and some of the weapons used by the PDF here. In October of 1989, a group of disgruntled PDF officers attempted a coup against Noriega. The U.S. government didn't offer any support, and it failed. Noriega had the coup leaders executed. What we did learn from that was which PDF units were most loyal and which weren't quite so, and what the PDF response would be to come to the aid of Noriega. With that as a backdrop, here's some of my recollections. I remember General Max Thurman, newly designated as a Southcom commander, visiting Fort Bragg in the summer of 1989 to discuss the planning. There was little doubt he wanted to pull the trigger on this operation. Things really heated up for the Corps staff. We worked a plan calling for a combination of troops and units already in Panama to join with U.S. forces parachuted or rapidly deployed into Panama from across the United States. You can see some of the units participating on the left of this chart. 26,000 U.S. troops were organized into 9 task forces with missions such as apprehending Manuel Noriega and other PDF leaders, seizing key airfields, capturing the Panamanian Defense Force headquarters, while securing the Canal Zone and other key facilities. The converging forces would strike 27 individual targets nearly simultaneously to decapitate the Panamanian government while defending 147 facilities in the Canal Zone. Then move to mop up the remaining Panamanian Defense Forces in the hinterlands outside the Canal Zone and prevent dispersed units from falling back into the jungle to conduct guerrilla operations. In October, we were alerted to deploy on news of the coup attempt. but were quickly shut down. President George H.W. Bush was sullied in the press and called a wimp. Later that month, there was an all-out firefight with U.S. forces guarding the Arahan tank farm near Howard Air Force Base with suspected Panamanian special forces. The U.S. again did nothing to respond. Then in November, there were reports that Noriega was moving a drug shipment through Panama, along with vague threats of provoking the U.S. with attacks on U.S. persons, both triggers to launch the operation. At Fort Bragg, we were alerted and subsequently deployed the small Corps Assault Command Post, about 30 of us, to Panama. I was the designated intelligence operations officer for the 5-person intelligence section that would form the nucleus of the intelligence staff for the stand-up of Joint Task Force South in Panama. I had the opportunity to spend some Thanksgiving, what I call quality time, at Fort Clayton there, but also got an on-the-ground orientation in preparation for the potential operation. However, the drugs weren't found and the provocations didn't materialize, so we went home. On December 15, 1989, Noriega and Panama's legislature declared a state of war existed with the United States. We saw that on the news, and I recall watching Noriega slamming a machete on the podium of the legislature as his way of approving the proposal. The next day, December 16th, members of the Panamanian Defense Forces shot and killed a U.S. Marine lieutenant, Lieutenant Robert Paz, at a PDF checkpoint. An American Navy officer and his wife who witnessed the shooting were detained, beaten, and threatened by the PDF. Back at Fort Bragg, we were again alerted, and I, with my rucksack and gear, went to work on that Saturday. Drew ammo and weapons, and prepared to deploy. We waited, but were finally told there was no presidential decision and to go home. I remember thinking, this is unbelievable. The U.S. has no guts, and to allow U.S. citizens to be killed and beaten without a response was unconscionable. I believed the wimp factor was true. The next 2 days were critical for me personally. I had a leave planned to go to my mother-in-law's home in Indiana for Christmas on the 18th. My father-in-law had passed away in July, and my wife's family was converging there to be with her mother for Christmas. My alert status was turned over to another officer, and I was free and clear to go on leave. Or so I thought. Before leaving, I got a call from my office. My boss wanted me to come in. So I did, and that turned into another trip to Panama and a very long day. My wife didn't quite understand why I didn't come home, though. President Bush had ordered Operation Just Cause, and D-Day was set for December 20th at 1 a.m. Panama time. The national objectives of the JTF mission for the operation are shown here. The plan was set into motion. The Corps Assault Command Post again arrived at Howard Air Force Base, and we were quickly moved into one of the outer hangars, away from possible eyes of Panamanian observers. Going into the hangars, I recall seeing rows of cots with burly men cleaning a wide assortment of non-standard weapons. It was the Special Operations Holding Area. I was now convinced this was for real. We trucked over to Fort Clayton to set up the Joint Task Force Command Post. The JTF South Command Post was located on Fort Clayton, and it was established to provide the command, control, coordination, and monitoring for the forces conducting the operation. My duties were to coordinate the intelligence support for the operation and keep the General Steiner and the staff aware of what was going on as far as the PDF. One of my duties was to give Lieutenant General Steiner and the staff an update on PDF activities. I did the intelligence, that is the enemy forces portion of the commander's update briefings. At 1700 or 5 p.m. on the 19th, or D-1, we were to give the final pre-assault briefing to Lieutenant General Steiner, the in-country commanders, liaisons, and key staff. 1,700 came and went, and I vividly remember waiting for General Steiner to arrive. He was at a meeting with General Thurman over at Quarry Heights, Southern Command headquarters, and the briefing started late. When it did, I gave the PDF overview, the laydown for each of the 27 targets, many of the blue dots you see on this map. I covered the latest PDF activities, number of troops on the targets, and reaction times from supporting forces. By the way, target number 1, Noriega, was under surveillance. He was traveling, but expected to spend the night at one of his houses in Panama City. One of the concerns was the PDF's most modern unit, Battalion 2000, at Fort Cimarron, located east of Panama City, and if they would come to the aid of Noriega, as we saw them do during the failed coup attempt, with 2 of our major targets, the Torrijos-Tucuman Airport or the PDF headquarters, La Comandancia, as possible reaction sites. I was asked a question about the dignity battalions. At the time, the intelligence assessment was they were rabble, Noriega's paid enforcers and thugs that wouldn't put up a fight. One of the commander's critical information requirements was indications of loss of surprise and resulting PDF reactions. While we were doing the D-1 update, the rest of the other units already in Panama were briefed in on the operation separately for the first time. When I left the command briefing area, I went into the intelligence cell to see what was going on. As I entered, a young specialist was coming out and must have noticed I missed that briefing. He said to me, "Sir, do you know we're going to war tonight?" "Yes," I said, "and we're here to start it." I spent most of the rest of the evening at my post in the operations center. In 1989, that was still in the early days of 24-hour news, and we had CNN playing on a TV in there. That evening, to our horror, we watched the news broadcasting live, showing paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division loading aircraft in a driving ice storm. The reporters and commentators were speculating their destination was Panama. We lost the element of surprise at that moment, and that for me was a gut-wrenching experience. Incredibly, our fellow citizens in the media just put the entire operation in jeopardy and 40,000 U.S. lives at risk. Shortly after that public service announcement, our monitoring of PDF communication showed that their command nets lighting up with commands for units to draw weapons and authorizations to shoot at anything they couldn't identify. Many of the PDF's senior officers went into hiding. Fighting broke out at Albrook Air Force Base near Fort Clayton. As a response to the loss of surprise, with pieces of a complex operation already in motion, Steiner moved up the special operations targets by 15 minutes. The clock ticked down, and by midnight, the operations center got incredibly quiet. Things started out badly. The weather was atrocious at Fort Bragg. Paratroopers were not only loading aircraft under the watchful eye of the news media, but in an ice storm while prepared for battle in the warm tropics. The weather resulted in half of the 82nd's assault force being delayed by about 3 hours. The special operations targets began being hit at 12:40 a.m. First reports started coming in. An incarcerated American government employee, Kurt Muse, was rescued from a Panamanian prison, but in the process, a special operations helicopter was shot down by ground fire and splashed into the canal. The team assigned to apprehend Noriega narrowly missed him at his Panama City home. He moved. U.S. Navy SEALs conducted an over-the-beach assault at nearby Patia Airport to disable Noriega's private jet and encounter some of the V-300 armored cars with .50 caliber machine guns not previously reported being there, resulting in the deaths of 4 Navy SEALs. Elsewhere, AC-130 gunships provided suppressive fire while 1,000 U.S. Army Rangers dropped onto Panama's main airfield, the Torrijos-Tocumen Airport. Simultaneously, 50 miles to the west of Panama City, a pair of new F-117 stealth fighters dropped 2,000-pound concussion munitions on the Rio Hato airfield, followed minutes later by another drop of another Ranger force to take out the PDF units there. An hour later, the first arriving battalions of the 82nd Airborne Division parachuted on to the Torrijos-Tocumen airfield and moved to their objectives. The airdrops and air assaults that were conducted later came under fire from the PDF, and fighting was intense. As the multiple assaults went down, reports indicated things were starting to go well. A Special Forces A-team with anti-armor weapons, backed up by AC-130 gunships, stopped Battalion 2000 coming out of Fort Cimarron at a choke point, the Pacora River Bridge, keeping them from coming to the aid of other PDF elements. The PDF was fighting back, and that was punctuated by a mortar attack on Fort Clayton. Fortunately, the building with our command post was narrowly missed, but 2 vehicles in the parking lot were not so fortunate. Fighting around PDF headquarters, La Comandancia, was particularly heavy. 2 more helicopters were shot down there, and fires from the fighting spread to the nearby poverty-stricken barrios. Throughout the rest of the day, other initial objectives were being secured. Augmentation and support forces began arriving into country. That afternoon, some of my compatriots from Fort Bragg arrived to augment the J2 section and help me out in the operations center. We were again in the briefing room for the commander's D-Day update, and Lieutenant General Steiner came in and said General Thurman was on his way over from Quarry Heights. I still remember hearing the whop, whop, whop of the helicopter landing on the parade field at Fort Clayton that afternoon, and I think about that every time I hear a helicopter landing now. Later, my boss received a tasking to provide an intelligence briefer for the newly created Joint Visitors Bureau. Because senior officers from the Pentagon, congressional staff, and member delegations were inbound to see firsthand what was going on. So my compatriots took over running the J2 operations section, and my full-time battle position for the rest of the operation would be one of the most difficult and stress-inducing jobs I ever had over my military career. The briefer. D-Day was a long day. By day's end, most of the heavy fighting was done. We had troops on the trail of Noriega, and other initial objectives were secured. The PDF suffered an estimated 110 casualties, and 1,300 had surrendered. U.S. casualties were relatively light. 19 killed and 99 wounded. The next few days melted together. The battle started moving to subsequent objectives to mop up the PDF forces in Panama's hinterlands, capture PDF leaders, and quell the lawlessness instigated by Noriega's Dignity Battalion thugs. By the way, Noriega's money could buy loyalty, and the Digbats started looting, setting fires, conducting drive-by shootings, and generally terrorizing the Panamanians and our troops. On D+2, the PDF staged an attack on Southern Command headquarters at Quarry Heights. That was driven back by the military police. On D+3, U.S. and former PDF police patrols began patrolling the streets of Panama cities, decreasing the looting and shooting incidents. Then on D+4, Christmas Eve, Manuel Noriega made a run for sanctuary into the Papal Nunciatura, or the Vatican's embassy. U.S. forces surrounded the embassy and began blasting rock music into it, notably, "You're no good, baby, you're no good," and "I fought the law and the law won." After D-Day, My days were filled with multiple briefings, with preparations starting very early in the mornings, with pre-briefs, commander's briefs, staff updates, more preparations, more briefings in the afternoons going late into the evening. The VIP briefs for the Joint Visitors Bureau were usually later in the evening, and then the VIPs would go on a battlefield circulation the next day. Once I got into a battle rhythm, I'd generally be able to break away after the evening VIP briefs for a final visit to the operations center to find out what was going on. Then to my bedroll by about midnight to start it all anew at 3 a.m. the next morning. My diet consisted of lots of coffee, but I knew I better be on my game as critical decisions were being made and actions were being generated as a result of what I said. Watching the senior commanders in action was an education in and of itself. General Thurman became a frequent visitor to our briefings, arriving by helicopter. That wop, wop, wop etched into my memory. One of the heroes of Just Cause was the Deputy JTF Commander, Major General Mark Cisneros, the commander of U.S. Army South and a Hispanic. He was instrumental in the surrender of many of the outlying PDF outposts. In an effort to reduce the bloodshed, the outpost would be surrounded by a ground force, then would put up an AC-130 gunship and a Volant Solo EC-130 PSYOPS aircraft. The PSYOPS aircraft would begin broadcasting the call to surrender. Cisneros would generally know the holdout commander. He was usually successful to get them to surrender. On the rare occasions when they decided not to, a demonstration by the AC-130 gunship seemed to work well to convince them. Over the next couple of weeks, PDF senior leaders were being rounded up, detained and interrogated in holding cells on Fort Clayton. Part of my briefing preparation was to read the reports, and I will personally attest that Noriega had turned Panama into a thugocracy. The brutality and repression of his political opponents was like something out of a horror movie. We obtained the PDF plans to resist a U.S. invasion. They had in fact planned to melt into the jungle, arm and turn the Dignity Battalion thugs loose to inflict casualties, reconstitute the PDF with masses of cached weapons to drag out the conflict, and break the will of the American people, something they learned during our experience during the Vietnam War. However, my observation of the senior detainees was they were well nourished under Noriega's patronage and probably wouldn't have lasted long in the jungle. My briefing slides were in high demand and were copied and provided to the commanders and liaison officers attending the briefs and faxed to the task forces and Southcom. I turned my charts and notes over to the intel cell after the morning briefs to produce the JTF's daily intelligence summary to be transmitted to commands around the world and to the Pentagon. In my briefings, I had a standard slide, something like this one, that showed number of PDF captured or surrendered and the weapons, ammunition, and money captured. This slide was duly marked secret, top and bottom. By the way, after the morning briefs, I generally have a chance to watch the CNN morning update in the operations center and saw this very same information accurately portrayed for the TV masses. I kept wondering, where did they get that information? By the way, we were expressly told not to report enemy killed. Why? The body count that occurred during the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, the body count was used as a measure to determine how successful we were in the war, and the numbers sometimes got inflated. We didn't report the enemy killed, and as a result, the total number of PDF killed is still in question. The Panamanians were very helpful in locating senior PDF commanders and pointing out cache sites containing thousands of stockpiled weapons and ammunition. By early January, things started slowing down somewhat. Noriega was still surrounded at the Vatican's embassy, and there were still holdout PDF elements, and Digbat snipings and lootings continued. Then Noriega surrendered on the 3rd of January. Around this time, I read a newspaper article from the New York Times or Washington Post. It was a few days old and tacked up on the bulletin board in the command area. The article talked about the pride being expressed by the American people on the effectiveness of the operation and the quality of the military. I realized then we had got past the Vietnam syndrome, that reluctance to use the military. I now know that was a blessing and a curse. Early one morning to start my briefing preparations, I went into the intel cell to get my update. I asked the team lead what was going on, and the reply was nothing. Oh no, I thought, knowing I was going to be on stage staring at about 10 stars and multiple colonels in a few short hours. Shortly thereafter, we started to prepare for the next phase of the operation, called Promote Liberty, to give Panama back to the Panamanians and turning that operation over to U.S. Army South Lead and planning our redeployment back to the U.S. Just Cause was widely acknowledged as a success. The planning and execution have been a model for subsequent military operations, using joint operations and simultaneous attacks to overwhelm an adversary, becoming the shock and awe demonstrated in the Gulf Wars, or when President Trump tells Iran, "We are prepared to strike 52 targets hard and fast." What happens after the fighting end was a lesson relearned in Just Cause and worked into planning for Operation Desert Storm for Kuwait in 1991 and in Haiti in 1994. Panama was quickly turned back to the Panamanians. The new president was sworn in on D-Day, and by D+3, the Panamanians were starting to provide government services. Manuel Noriega was extradited, tried, and convicted on a variety of criminal charges. In spite of the compromise of the operation by the news media, U.S. losses were relatively light. 23 killed, 324 wounded. I've often wondered what our casualties would have been had the press responsibly withheld coverage and announcement until after the initial assaults. This did, however, serve to change how the military worked with the news media in subsequent operations, embargoing the release of information until a specified time and embedding reporters with units. Looking back over 30 years, in my opinion, the lasting legacy of Just Cause was it restored confidence in the military by the public, our government, and within the military itself. As an example, Gallup polls started showing the U.S. military as the most trusted institution in our country, and that continues to the present. As a result of Operation Just Cause, an expansion and willingness to jump to a military option became much quicker instead of relying on other elements of national power. On the 16th of January 1990, 18th Airborne Corps and 82nd Airborne Division elements from JTF South returned home from Panama, parachuting back into Fort Bragg. 2,000 jumpers in all. I was on that jump, the number 15 jumper from the lead aircraft. We assembled and marched over a small hill to awaiting family, friends, and the news media was there to record the event. Welcome back as heroes. I even think my wife forgave me for missing Christmas with her family. Thank you, and I've got a few things I want to show you here from the Veterans Memorial Museum. First off, this is the uniforms we were wearing in Panama. It was a woodland camouflage type uniform. Worked very well in Panama with all the green there.
All right, we're going to have to...
So here's the uniform we were wearing in Panama. This is a woodland camouflage pattern. Worked very well in the Panama with the jungles. Fit very well in there. A little different than the uniforms today. The maroon beret was worn by the airborne units that jumped in. The Rangers back then were wearing black berets, the standard Army beret now. Now, of course, they wear tan berets. Some of you are probably familiar with the Kevlar steel pot that's used. A little bigger than the ones that are in standard issue right now, but this was a pretty good thing to take care of stopping bullets and so forth. This is an M16 rifle. You're probably familiar with that. Can be either full automatic or semi-automatic. U.S. forces carried this one. Interesting, some of the Panamanian forces also had this, and they had a Japanese variant of it. But this was a popular weapon in Panama on both sides. I mentioned that Manuel Noriega was buying a lot of equipment from Cuba and the Soviet Union. This is an AK-47, the bayonets. We found thousands of these in cache sites across Panama. Every person that deployed into Panama received a bayonet from the cache sites as a war trophy that was presented to them for being part of Operation Just Cause. And of course, the military wore the patrol caps when they were in the field, or and not wearing a Kevlar, but that's the patrol cap. So again, thank you, and hope you learned something today about an operation that a lot of people have forgotten about, but was pretty important to our military. Thanks.